Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're asking a really fundamental question. Can Britain's universities actually be world-class, financially stable, and accessible to everyone, all at the same time? It feels, well, particularly urgent right now. You've probably seen the headlines, haven't you? Reports of universities in, let's say, a pretty tough spot financially. Budget cuts, course closures, even staff layoffs making the news. And The Economist recently weighed in with a pretty punchy article declaring universities more broke than a student after a summer of interrailing. Ouch. Their core argument seems to be that UK unis have kind of lost their focus, not concentrating on efficiency for the mass market, maybe spending a bit wastefully, getting too obsessed with global rankings instead of core value. But like most things, it's probably not quite that simple. So today we're going to unpack The Economist's take, yes, but also bring in some other context, some alternative views, to give you a hopefully more rounded picture of what's really going on. You might find some common assumptions don't quite hold up. So let's start with The Economist's diagnosis. They paint a fairly grim picture, don't they? What's the core of their argument about the financial health situation?
It is a stark assessment, yeah. They quote the Office for Students, the OFS, the regulator in England, estimating that 4 out of 10 universities are running deficits right now.
4 in 10? That's a lot.
It is. And it's not just abstract numbers. Half of universities, they say, have already cut courses this year to save cash. That's double the number from 2024. And we're seeing real staff cuts. Durham, Newcastle, shedding hundreds of staff. There are even claims that Lancaster's plan could mean, nearly 1 in 5 academics losing their job.
That's huge, a massive impact. And The Economist seems to link a lot of this pressure back to the tuition fees, is that right?
Exactly. That's the sort of proximate cause they point to. The real value of those fees for English students has just plummeted. They've been frozen at £9,250 for years. There is a tiny rise coming in August, the first in 8 years, but it's only a few percent. And the key thing is, Treasury officials are apparently briefing that bigger rises are just off the table.
So way below inflation.
Oh yeah, far below the 24% inflation hit since 2017. So universities are getting less real money per student than they did almost a decade ago.
Right, and yet The Economist doesn't just leave it there, do they? They also suggest the government is maybe wise not to pour in a lot more money, implying universities haven't always been, well, careful spenders.
Yeah, that's the other side of their argument. They suggest universities perhaps enjoyed some of the highest budgets globally for a while and maybe didn't spend it all wisely. Wasteful spending is part of the problem, in their view.
And where do they say that money went?
Well, they talk about a binge on grand campuses after 2012. Capital project spending between 2014 and 2018, they claim, was comparable to staging the entire London Olympics.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
It is. And they also flagged the growth in non-academic staff. They mentioned managers and professionals' roles swelling by 60% between 2006 and 2018.
60%. Okay. And then the student debt issue, that always comes up. The article flags English students graduating with average debts around £45,000. They compare that to about $29,000 in America. That feels like a really stark difference.
It is striking, and it really highlights the burden. It's worth noting, too, our background info suggests new graduates who start repaying from next April, their average debt is even higher, £53,000.
53. Good grief.
Yeah, which actually overtakes that 2023 U.S. average by nearly 80%. So however the money's being spent by unis, the debt pile for students is undeniably massive.
Okay, so we've got deficits, frozen fees, claims of wasteful spending, huge student debt. And The Economist ties this together by saying British higher education is too sort of uniform, too homogenous.
That's right. Too obsessed with being world-class, they argue, rather than being efficient, competing on fancy campuses and student services rather than, say, price or teaching methods. And they're quite critical of the focus on global rankings, calling it mere vanity, implying it drives spending on research that doesn't necessarily help undergraduate learning.
Okay, so that's The Economist's perspective laid out, a pretty strong critique. But as always, this is where we dig a bit deeper, isn't it? What happens when we start to look at some of these claims with a bit more context? Does it all stack up?
Absolutely. This is where it gets really interesting. Let's take that idea first, that world-class pretensions caused bloat, and unis should just trim the fat. Now, it's true capital spending surged after 2012, but the background suggests roughly a third of that spend actually went into research labs.
Ah, okay. Not just student unions and accommodation, then.
Exactly. These labs are crucial for the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. That's how the government assesses research quality, and it directly links to funding in those important industry contracts. So this spending is actually a vital cross-subsidy. It helps keep UK research up there globally. If you just did a pure teaching-only efficiency drive, you could accidentally damage that research base quite badly.
I see. So the spending picture is maybe more complex. What about the staffing ratios? That claim of 14 students per teacher in Britain sounding very inefficient compared to 18 elsewhere.
Yeah, that 14.1 figure sounds damning, doesn't it? But it seems to come from older, maybe narrower data. The latest OECD tables, the ones that compare across rich countries, actually put the UK tertiary student-staff ratio at 17.1.
17 to 1.
Yeah, which is, as they say, almost bang on the rich country median. So that gap the economists highlighted seems to have largely closed already.
Right, so cutting further based on that older figure might actually push the UK above the average, potentially harming student support.
Precisely. It shows how important it is to use the most current, comparable data.
Okay, point taken. Now, what about this idea that unis compete on campuses, not price? The Economist suggests students themselves are allergic to lower fees, fearing a cut-rate degree.
Well, there's probably some truth in that student perception. Nobody wants a degree that feels cheap, right? But our background info highlights something else. Price competition is also legally very difficult for universities. Because if a university charges less than the £9,250 cap, it actually reduces the flow of loan repayments back to the government. And it triggers tougher compliance checks from the Office for Students.
So it's actually harder work and potentially less rewarding financially to charge less.
Exactly. It creates this sort of weird, inverted incentive. It's often just easier bureaucratically and financially to charge the maximum allowed fee. So until that whole funding formula changes, just telling universities to compete on price doesn't really work.
That's fascinating, a hidden structural issue. Okay, what about the rankings obsession being mere vanity, just chasing league table positions for ego?
Again, it might look like that from the outside, but those global rankings now directly influence where international students choose to study.
Yeah.
And their higher fees are crucial. Overseas students already bring in over 20% of all teaching income. And with tighter visa rules recently, universities are actually more dependent on attracting those students, not less.
So chasing rankings isn't just ego, it's part of the business model, a survival strategy.
In many cases, yes. It's about cross-subsidy survival. Those international fees are plugging the gaps left by the frozen domestic fees and research funding shortfalls.
Right. And finally, that idea of cutting non-academic jobs as low-hanging fruit.
It sounds simple, doesn't it? Trim the bureaucracy. But, a lot of the growth in those roles has been in areas like risk management, data protection, student well-being. Why? Because things like GDPR data rules, new OFS safeguarding codes, the focus on student mental health, these have all piled on new compliance costs and requirements since around 2018.
So some of that growth isn't discretionary fluff, it's driven by external regulation.
A significant chunk of it, yes. So just applying blunt staffing ratios misses that whole picture. It's not always fat that can be easily trimmed without consequences. And beyond just challenging some of the economist's specific points, there are these bigger sort of structural pinch points in the system that maybe didn't get fully explored in that article. These are the really deep-seated issues.
Okay, tell us about those. What are we talking about here?
Well, one huge one is what you could call cross-subsidy roulette. It sounds dramatic, but teaching home undergraduates, believe it or not, actually loses money in most science, tech, engineering, and math subjects, even in some art subjects too.
Really? They lose money teaching UK students?
In many cases, yes, because the fee doesn't cover the full cost. So universities plug that gap with the higher fees from overseas students and income from commercial research spinouts. But both of those are, cyclical. They depend on the economy, politics. They're fragile.
A risky balancing act, then.
Very. Then there's the research funding cliff. Those big grants from UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, they rarely cover the full economic cost of doing the research. For every pound spent in a lab, the university often has to find about 40 pence from its own funds to subsidize it. That limits how much you can cut from the teaching side because you need funds to keep the research going.
Right, it's all interconnected. And you mentioned something affecting students directly, the commuter campus paradox.
Yeah. The Economist sort of touches on cheaper local study options, but it doesn't really factor in UK housing policy. I mean, try finding affordable rent near unis in London, Manchester, Bristol.
It's incredibly difficult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea of lots more students just living at home and commuting, it often bumps up against the reality of transport costs and, crucially, sky-high rents even further out. It's not always just about student preference for moving away. And one final point, regulatory drag. The OFS, the regulator, has brought in new metrics focused on student outcomes, like graduate job rates, which sounds good, but
But it means more work for the universities.
a lot more data collection, reporting, administration, even while their budgets are shrinking. It's like a hidden compliance tax that's rarely mentioned when people talk about efficiency.
Okay, so given all this, the nuances, the structural problems, what could genuine workable efficiency look like? Are there any radical ideas or examples from elsewhere?
Well, the background material flags a few possibilities. One is the idea of modular credit wallets. Think like Singapore Skills Future credits.
How do they work?
Basically, individuals get government funding for shorter, bite-sized courses throughout their lives, focusing on upskilling. It avoids saddling an 18-year-old with huge debt for a 3-year degree they might not need. But, to make it work here, you'd need a really good online platform quickly and probably get employers to chip in. Otherwise, people might just use the credits for hobby courses.
Interesting. What else?
Another model is creating more distinct types of universities, like Germany's Fachhochschulen universities of applied sciences. These are much more focused on practical, vocational teaching, separate from the big, research-intensive universities.
So a clearer divide between research and teaching focus.
Potentially. But it would take political bravery to manage that split, maybe ring-fence funding differently. And there's always the risk you create a two-tier system where it's harder for students to move between the practical and academic tracks.
Tricky. What about just shortening degrees? 2-year accelerated degrees. They're legal now, aren't they?
They are, since 2018. And some places, like Bond University in Australia, loads of U.S. colleges run year-round timetables to cut the total cost and get students out faster.
But they haven't taken off here.
Barely. Uptake in England is apparently below 2%. And a key reason seems to be the way student loans work. Interest still racks up over the longer repayment period, even though you study for less time. For many students, the overall financial benefit just isn't clear enough.
Right. Another incentive problem. Any other ideas?
One final one is more shared service outsourcing. Universities pooling their back office stuff, finance, HR, IT systems. Like in New Zealand, where all 8 universities apparently co-own a national system for managing operations.
Sounds sensible. Why hasn't that happened more here?
Culture, maybe. Resistance to change. Legacy IT systems that don't talk to each other. It might need a push, perhaps some seed funding from the Treasury to overcome that inertia.
This really does crystallize the challenge, doesn't it? For any government, for anyone thinking about Britain's future.
It really does. The absolute core policy test is, can one system do it all? Can it deliver world-class research and affordable mass teaching without a totally fresh funding approach? It feels like we're reaching a crunch point.
And what's actually at stake if we can't square that circle?
The stakes are huge.
Yeah.
If the 9,250 cap stays frozen for another parliament, then by 2030, the actual resources per student in real terms could be 35% lower than they were back in 2012.
35% less funding per student.
But real terms, yes. Combine that with potential visa curbs hitting international student numbers, and you risk what some are calling a doom loop. Home students cost more to teach than their fees cover. The overseas money shrinks, and research funding gets squeezed even harder. Our analysis suggests maybe a clearer split is needed. Perhaps national universities focused on research funded differently, maybe with block grants, and regional providers focused on high-volume teaching, perhaps funded via those flexible credit accounts we talked about. At least that might align the money with the mission.
It really brings us back to the economist's own conclusion, doesn't it? That until politicians choose a clearer path, just telling university leaders to be lean, local, global, and top-ranked all at once, well, it's an equation that does not add up, as they put it.
Exactly. It's asking the system to be all things to all people, without the funding or the strategic clarity to actually achieve it.
So we've really tried to get behind the headlines today, looking at the very tangled financial web UK universities find themselves in. We've unpacked the economist's critique, but also added layers of context, showing where things might be more complicated or where other evidence points.
Yeah, we've seen it's not just about alleged waste. It's about deep structural issues, regulatory burdens, intense global competition, things that often get missed in the broader debate.
Which leaves a pretty big question for you, the listener, to think about. If policymakers had to choose between world-class research, mass teaching, and financial stability, what would UK higher education look like? What would that choice mean for students, for the economy, for Britain's place in the world? It's a choice that might just define the future of learning in this country. Thank you for joining us for this exploration.